The winter that changed everything began with a pharmacy and a woman I had never seen before in my life. It was a Tuesday morning in late November, the kind of morning that arrives in Kingston, Ontario, like a quiet threat, the sky, a flat white, the air sharp enough to make your eyes water before you even reach the end of the driveway. I had pulled on my wool coat, the navy one my husband Richard had bought me 3 Christmases before he passed, and driven myself to the Shoppers Drug Mart on Princess Street to pick up my blood pressure medication. Nothing unusual. Nothing to suggest that the next 48 hours would unravel everything I thought I understood about my own family. I was 67 years old. I had been a registered nurse for 31 years at Kingston General Hospital before I retired. I had held the hands of dying strangers, delivered news that broke families apart, and stood steady in rooms where other people collapsed. I thought I knew how to read people. I thought, after everything, that I was not the kind of woman who could be fooled. I was wrong. Richard had passed away 22 months earlier from a sudden cardiac event. That is what the death certificate said. Sudden cardiac event. As if his heart simply made a decision one Thursday afternoon in April and acted on it without consulting either of us. We had been married for 41 years. We had raised 2 children in the house on Barry Street, a Victorian with a wraparound porch and a backyard maple that turned so red in October it looked like it was on fire. When Richard died, I stayed in the house. Everyone told me I should sell. My daughter, who lived in Vancouver and called twice a week with careful concern in her voice, suggested a condo. Smaller, easier to manage. My son, who lived 20 minutes away in Napanee with his wife, offered to help me look at my options. I should have paid more attention to that phrase, look at my options, as if my options were something to be looked at by someone else. But grief does something to your attention. It narrows it. In those first months after Richard died, I could only manage one thing at a time. Get dressed, make tea, drive to the pharmacy, come home. The bigger picture, the finances, the estate, the paperwork that kept arriving in envelopes, I stacked on the dining room table and told myself I would deal with later. All of that stayed on the periphery of my vision, soft and unresolved. Richard had handled the finances. Not because I was not capable. I was capable. I had simply trusted him, and then I had trusted the grief, and then, without fully noticing, I had trusted my son. His name was Lucas. He was 38 years old. He worked in real estate, had his own small brokerage in Napanee. Nothing grand, but he was comfortable. His wife, Marissa, was the kind of woman who smiled at you with perfect steadiness while her eyes stayed somewhere else entirely. I had never been able to say anything specific about Marissa. She was always polite. She always brought something when they came to dinner. But in 41 years of nursing, I had learned that the people you cannot say anything specific about are sometimes the ones you need to watch most carefully. I had not watched carefully enough. That Tuesday morning at Shoppers, I picked up my prescription and stopped at the greeting card section on my way out, the way I sometimes did, just to linger. There was a woman browsing nearby, somewhere in her 50s, wearing a dark green parka and reading glasses pushed up on her head. She had the look of someone who worked with her hands, practical shoes, no rings, hair pulled back without ceremony. I did not recognize her. Kingston is not a small town, but it is not Toronto either, and after nearly 4 decades, I knew most of the faces in my neighborhood. Hers was not one of them. She glanced up and looked at me for a moment. Then she looked down again. Then she stepped closer than felt natural, and said, in a voice so low I nearly missed it beneath the overhead music, "Don't sign anything this week." I looked at her. "I beg your pardon?" She was already moving away, head down, card in hand, walking toward the cash. By the time I stepped around the display rack she had paid and was through the doors, I stood on the mat while the automatic doors opened and let in a gust of cold air and I watched her cross the parking lot and get into a gray Subaru and drive away without looking back. I stood there for what must have been a full minute. Don't sign anything this week. I told myself it was a mistake. Wrong person. She had confused me with someone else. I drove home on Division Street with the heat on full and the radio off, and I told myself it was nothing, and I almost believed it. And then I turned onto Berry Street and saw Lucas's truck in my driveway. He was waiting on the porch, hands in his coat pockets, breath coming in small clouds. He smiled when he saw me. Lucas had Richard's smile broad, easy, the kind that arrived quickly and made you feel immediately at ease. For 38 years, that smile had made me feel nothing but warmth. That morning, for the first time, it made me feel something I could not immediately name. Mom. He came down the steps and took my pharmacy bag without asking. I've been calling you. My phone was in my purse. Come in, I'll make tea. He followed me inside. Marissa was not with him, which was unusual. She came to most things. I noticed it but said nothing. I put the kettle on and he sat at the kitchen table and talked about the weather and asked about my knee and mentioned casually that he'd spoken to someone at his office about the estate. The estate, I said. Just some paperwork, Mom. Boring stuff. I thought we could go through it together this week if you're up to it. There are a couple of things that need your signature before the end of the year for tax purposes. The kettle clicked. I turned around and I looked at my son and I heard, very clearly, underneath the ordinary words, the sound of that woman's voice in the pharmacy. Don't sign anything this week. What kind of paperwork? I asked. Just estate transfer stuff. The financial planners. Regular standard. I've been handling most of it to save you the trouble. I set down the mugs. Lucas, I wasn't aware you'd been in contact with Richard's financial planner. He paused. Just briefly. The smile held, but something shifted behind it, the way a stage set will sway slightly if you press against the flat. I reached out after Dad passed. To get an overview, so I could help. Of course, I said. That's kind of you. We drank our tea. He left an hour later with a folder he said he'd bring back at the end of the week, once he'd had his colleague look it over again. Standard, he said again at the door. Just routine. I nodded and waved, and went back inside, and stood in the hallway in my coat, and did not move for a long time. I had spent 31 years as a nurse. I knew what it looked like when someone was giving you information at a carefully managed dose. That evening, I went to the dining room and I opened the stack of envelopes. It took me 3 hours. I made a second pot of tea and then a third, and I went through every piece of paper I had deferred and avoided and told myself I would deal with later. Most of it was ordinary. Insurance correspondence, property tax statements, a letter from Richard's former employer about his pension. But in the second stack, beneath a Rogers bill I had never opened, I found a letter from TD Bank dated 4 months earlier. It was addressed to me. It referenced a joint account I had not known existed, an account opened under both my name and Lucas's, with a note indicating I had authorized him as a co-signatory. I had not authorized anything. I read the letter 3 times. The account had been opened 8 months after Richard died. There were transfers into it from Richard's RSP, from the joint savings account Richard and I had kept together for 20 years. The amounts were not small. I sat at the dining room table under the overhead light, with the letter in both hands, and I felt, underneath the cold, steady fact of what I was reading, a grief different from the one I had carried for 22 months. That grief had been clean. It had been the grief of losing someone I loved. This grief was dirtier. This grief had my son's name on it. I did not sleep that night. I sat in Richard's armchair in the front room, and I watched the maple in the backyard, and I tried to think clearly. I was 67 years old. I had no financial background beyond my own household, and whatever Richard had taught me. I did not know what this letter meant legally. I did not know what I did not know, and that frightened me more than anything else. In the morning I called my daughter. Her name was Patricia. She was 41, a landscape architect in Vancouver, steady and practical, and honest in the blunt, affectionate way that had occasionally driven me to frustration and now felt like the most valuable quality a person could possess. I told her about the pharmacy. I told her about Lucas. I told her about the letter. There was a silence on the line that had the particular quality of someone working very hard to stay calm. "Mom," she said finally, "do not sign anything." "I know. Do you have the original documents? The estate paperwork from when Dad died?" In the filing cabinet in the study, Richard organized everything. "I'm coming home." "Patricia, you don't need to. I'm coming home Thursday. Don't tell Lucas." She booked the flight that morning. I spent Wednesday in the study, pulling out files, reading documents I should have read a year ago. What I found, over those slow, quiet hours with the winter light coming through the window, was a picture that assembled itself piece by piece into something I kept wishing was not real. Richard had left a clear estate, a paid-off mortgage on the Barry Street house, a modest RRIF, a life insurance policy, a savings account. Together it amounted to something comfortable, not wealthy, but the kind of stability that comes from 40 years of careful living. Under his will, everything was to pass to me, with provisions for Lucas and Patricia after my death. It was clean and clear and had been prepared by a lawyer in 2019. What I found in the newer documents, the ones Lucas had apparently gathered on my behalf, was something different. A proposed transfer of the house into a family trust, with Lucas and Marissa as co-trustees. A form that would give Lucas power of attorney over my financial accounts. A document I could not fully parse that appeared to involve the refinancing of the house. None of it had been explained to me. All of it required my signature. I sat in the study until dark. I thought about my husband, who had been a quiet and meticulous man, who had kept every receipt in labeled folders and never once made a financial decision without telling me. I thought about the months after his death when Lucas had been so present, so helpful, driving me to appointments and handling phone calls and telling me not to worry. I thought about how grief, when it is large enough, makes you grateful to anyone who takes something off your hands. I thought about Marissa's smile. Patricia arrived Thursday afternoon. I picked her up from the Kingston airport, and we sat at the kitchen table with the documents spread between us, and she was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "Mom, we need a lawyer. I know, not Lucas's people. Someone independent." I had a name, a woman who had handled a property dispute for my neighbor 2 years ago. I called her that evening. She could see me Friday morning. Lucas called Thursday night, cheerful, asking if I'd had a chance to look over the folder. I told him I was still reviewing it and would be in touch next week. He said, of course, no rush. "Take your time," the same easy warmth in his voice. I said good night and sat for a moment with the phone in my hand and understood, in a way I had not fully allowed myself to yet, that I was grieving two things at once. My husband, who had been honest, and the version of my son I had believed in. The lawyer's name was Helen Okafor. She was in her 50s, precise and unhurried, and she listened to everything without writing anything down until I was finished. Then she asked 3 questions, looked at the documents for 15 minutes and said, "This power of attorney form, if signed, would give your son the legal authority to make financial decisions on your behalf. Combined with his existing access to the joint account, he would have significant control over your assets. I don't know what his intentions are, but you were right not to sign." "The joint account," I said. "I never agreed to that." Then we need to speak to the bank, and we need to know how your signature appeared on the opening documents. That is the thing about being a retired nurse. You understand that sometimes the question is not whether the illness is serious. The question is how long it has been progressing. Patricia and I went to TD Bank that afternoon. The branch manager, a young man who was visibly uncomfortable, confirmed that an account had been opened in my name 8 months after Richard's death. He showed me the authorization form. The signature on it was mine. It was not mine. I had not cried since the morning Richard died. I did not cry in the bank. I sat very straight in the chair, and I looked at the copy of my own forged signature, and I felt something settle in me, cold and final. I had been a nurse for 31 years. I had seen people in the worst moments of their lives, and I had learned that the most important thing you can do in those moments is stay present, stay clear. Do not let the size of it take you under. I stayed clear. We filed a report with Kingston police that evening. The investigating officer was a woman my age, calm and matter-of-fact, and she took the documents and my statement and told me the bank would be contacted and the account frozen. The next 48 hours were procedural and exhausting in the way that all institutional processes are forms, phone calls, waiting rooms. Patricia was with me for all of it. She slept in her old room and made coffee in the morning, and did not try to make me feel better with words, which was exactly right. There is a time for words, and a time for simply being present, and she knew the difference. Lucas called twice. I did not answer. He came to the house on Saturday morning. He knocked, and then he used his key. He had had one since Richard died, for emergencies, and he came into the front room and found Patricia and me sitting on the sofa, and he stopped. Whatever he had been prepared to say left him all at once. I watched it happen. The ease, the readiness, the practiced warmth, all of it fell away, and what was left was something much younger and much more frightened. "Mom, sit down, Lucas." He sat. I told him what we had found. I told him about the bank. I told him the account had been frozen and the police had our statement. I told him about the power of attorney form and the trust documents and the refinancing paperwork. I told him all of it quietly, the way I used to tell families in the hospital what they needed to know, clearly, completely, without softening it into something easier to hold. He did not deny it. He started to, once, and then he stopped. Marissa, it emerged, had been the architect of most of it. She had connections in the real estate world that I will not detail here because the investigation was still proceeding when I began telling this story. What I can tell you is that the plan had been gradual and patient and had relied entirely on my grief, my trust, and my habit of letting someone else handle things I did not want to think about. I looked at my son across the coffee table where I had sat with him since he was old enough to hold a cup, and I said, "I need you to leave my house now." He stood. He looked smaller than he had ever looked. At the door, he turned back and said, "I'm sorry, Mom." His voice broke on it. I believed it was true. I also believed that being sorry, when it arrives this late, is not the same as being trustworthy. I had spent a career learning that distinction. I closed the door. The weeks that followed were not simple. There were lawyers and bank processes and conversations with my daughter that lasted until midnight. There was the business of changing locks and updating documents, and slowly, carefully, learning everything about my own financial life that I had given away to grief. It was not easy. It was sometimes humiliating, and I will not pretend otherwise. There is a specific shame in being a competent woman who was nonetheless taken advantage of, and I sat with that shame long enough to understand that it did not belong to me. I had been trusting. Trust, offered in good faith, is not stupidity. The failure was not mine. The house on Barry Street is still mine. The maple turned red again in October, the way it does every year, and I stood at the kitchen window with my coffee and watched it and thought about Richard. I think about him differently now than I did in those first terrible months after he died. I think about the way he kept every receipt in labeled folders, the care he took. He built something solid, and he trusted me to hold it, and in my grief I nearly let it go. I did not let it go. The woman from the pharmacy, I found out who she was 3 months later, through a mutual acquaintance. She had worked briefly in Lucas's real estate office and had left after becoming aware of certain practices she was not willing to be part of. She had seen Lucas and Marissa with me once, in the parking lot of the pharmacy, and had recognized something in the way they stood beside me that she could not ignore. I asked my acquaintance to pass along a message for me. I asked her to tell the woman that it had mattered. That 6 words, delivered quietly between the greeting cards, had been enough. I never saw her again. But there are people like that in the world, people who see something wrong and say something, not because they will get anything from it, not because it is easy or comfortable, but because they cannot look away. Richard was like that. Patricia is like that. I spent 31 years trying to be like that, in a hospital, in the small hours of the night, when what someone needed was the truth spoken clearly by someone who was willing to stay in the room. I am 68 now. I have a financial advisor I chose myself, a woman who was recommended by Helen Okafor, and we meet every 3 months, and she explains everything in language I understand, and I ask every question I need to ask. I have a new will. I have updated every document. I know what I own, and I know what it means. My son and I have not spoken since that Saturday morning. I do not know if we will. That door is not locked, but I am not the one who needs to open it. What I know is this: grief will make you smaller if you let it. It will make you grateful for any hand that reaches in, and it will not always warn you whose hand it is. The antidote to grief is not haste, and it is not isolation. It is the slow, uncomfortable work of remaining present in your own life, paying attention to your own affairs, and being willing to ask the questions you have been putting off, because asking them means accepting what the answers might be. I drove to the pharmacy on Princess Street last week. Routine prescription, cold morning, the same flat white sky. I stood in the greeting card aisle for a moment on my way out, between the birthday cards and the thinking of you cards, and I stood there quietly. I did not need anyone to tell me anything. I already knew